Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Technology Philosophy. Today I would like to talk about Derrida's theory of subjectivation. Derrida's subjectivation reconfigures the human data-touch relation. In considering the intersection of touch and technology, one of the strongest new presences in contemporary life is big data, the collection and use of personal data by large institutions. As individuals, we can feel powerless in our relation with data. This is because the human-data relation is asymmetric. The asymmetry is analogous to that of the more visceral example of drones, which similarly can see us without our seeing them and touch us without our being able to touch them. What is missing in the human-data relation is the capability for humans to touch data in a meaningful way. The asymmetry of touch leads to an impoverished subjectivation of both human and data. Big data creates a false metonymy in trying to subjectivate the whole individual from an incomplete data stream, while humans have almost no sight or conceptualization of the entity that is big data. I argue that Derrida's views on subjectivation can be used to improve the human-data relation. Following the post-structuralist dissolution of the subject, Derrida offers an account of subjectivation updated for the technological milieu in On Touching that nicely complements his general theory of subjectivation based on his key concepts of deconstruction and difference. I show how Derrida's subjectivation can be read into the human-data relation such that we can let go of the punctual simplicity of the classical subject, where the primacy and persistence of identity across time is an aspect. Instead, we can envision a new realm of subjectivation based on dynamic flows and prosthetics. In On Touching, Derrida gives an account of subjectivation through technology and touch using the two main concepts of the book, self-touch and self-touching you. He sets the foundation by describing how touch, the body, technology, and prosthesis are linked together in subjectivation. Derrida agrees with and adopts Jean-Luc Nancy's terms techné of the body and ecotechnique to refer to technology, the technical, and techné. However, techné of the body and ecotechnique mean more than just technology. They connote creation, genesis, reproduction, and multiplication. The body is technical from the beginning, where technology is understood as the technique and capability of producing the human body and connecting it to the world through touch. Ecotechnique produces the body and links it to the world through touch. Touch is the relation of man to the world. The intimacy of touch, body, and technology in generative linkage is typified by Derrida's example of surgery. Derrida underlines that Nancy's constant attention to the technical dimension, prostheses, transplants, etc., is what is distinctive of his thinking on touching. Touch is technical. The next move is thinking ecotechnique, the productive linkage between touch, body, and technology, as the notion of the prosthetic. Per Derrida, it is the thinking of a techné of bodies as thinking of the prosthetic supplement that is one of Nancy's biggest differences. Ecotechnique is the prosthetic supplement. Derrida explains that ecotechnique is Nancy's thinking about the body proper, the flesh, touch, techniques, and technical exappropriation of the phenomenological threshold of the body. The terms phenomenological threshold of the body and supplement, i.e. a deconstructive strategy, indicate that the prosthetic is a means of deconstructing the traditional concept, form, and limits of the body. The prosthetic, i.e. prosthetic, transplant, operation, enhancement, augmentation, or anthropotechnie, opens up a new form of existence, which has benefits and detriments and limits to be probed. The subject, which has always been generated by the ecotechnique of technology and touch, is now, as Nancy realized, being generated by the prosthetic as ecotechnique. there is an eco-technique of prosthetics. The eco-technique of prosthetics leads to a heightened form of subjectivation. As both Nancy and Goffet notice, the consequence is that the interiority of personal contingency, the existence of the subject, is recast into exteriority as the problem of the contingency of technology, because more than ever the current technological milieu dictates the subject's lifespan. The subject has more capability but diminished control and identity. For Nancy, this disruption exposes the prosthetic as an intruder, an incarnation, an uninterrupted death, carrying with it rejection, autoimmunity, and technical expropriation, which results for Goffet in a displaced subjectivity. In the intimacy of eco-technique and touch, the intruding prosthetic becomes simultaneously an interior exteriority and an exterior interiority. The eco-technique of prosthetics engenders subjectivation through a new kind of interplay between interiority and exteriority. Now, with this foundation, we can turn to Derrida's two central concepts in On Touching, self-touch and self-touching you. Similarly, the overarching theme is the relation between interiority and exteriority, particularly bringing interiority to exteriority to trigger subjectivation that is not possible with interiority alone. The interiority-exteriority relation is at play in the self-touch relation. The definition of self-touch, an I that touches itself as other, includes the interiority of the self and the exteriority of the positioning of the self as other. The concept exscription, part of the new corpus of conceptuality that Nancy contributes, helps to operate the interiority-exteriority relation in the process of subjectivation. To exscribe is to create through expulsion and originary abjection. Exscribe is the opposite of inscribe, referring to things that are written outside in an exteriority, an ex. The most important originary creations are written into an exteriority. In thinking the self in this way of excess and exscription, subjectivation occurs as a self-touch of writing in exteriority, throwing the ego's subjectivity into exteriority. In this reflexive fold, the question of touch, of self-touching, has taken up residence beforehand. The self-touch relation already anticipates subjectivation because it inhabits the exteriority of the fold. Subjectivation is the operation of self-touch writing itself into the reflexive fold between the subject and the subject's ego in exteriority. The exterior reflexive fold of subjectivation appears similarly in Valéry's bouche and Heidegger's Geworfenheit, the opening into which the I is thrown. The self-touch relation effects subjectivation by exscription, writing itself in exteriority. The focus on exteriority allows the next moment in the argument, the discussion of incommensurables. For Nancy, the incommensurable is something that is absolutely unique, singular, and irreplaceable. In subjectivation, different incommensurables are linked, such as soul and body, psychic thinking and body, and thinking and extension. The prefix X in exteriority lets Nancy think the exorbitant, the logic of the inexorably exorbitant in relation to the incommensurable. There is no measure to expect here. The incommensurable is what makes possible the quasi-permixtio, the sort of mixture of the union of incommensurables, making it a thinking that is incommensurable itself, that is exorbitant in relation to thinking. In the mix of incommensurables, thinking is extended. Thus, a requirement for subjectivation is thinking that is exorbitant in relation to thinking, thinking that goes beyond thinking, a thinking that can imagine and actuate thinking beyond itself. Excess to itself is a familiar concept in subjectivation. For Simondon, the individual thinks in excess of itself as pre-individual potential that sees beyond already individuated individuations to new individuations. For Derrida, subjectivation is a process of extending what can be obtained in the individual's own intentional system. Continuing in the book On Touching, the union of incommensurables remains Derrida's central project. He tries to connect psychical thinking with the body through sight and touch, wondering if the right sort of mix of body and soul is seen or rather touched. Interiority-exteriority is also at the heart of the self-touching you concept. The self-touching you relation is described as, in order for me to be touched by you, I have to be able to touch myself. In the self-touching you, the self is as indispensable as the you. There is a process between self and you, where the self-touching you is the self-touching you, such that only the self-touching you, and not oneself, can interrupt the reappropriation or the absolute reflection of self-presence. Subjectivation, reappropriation and reflection of self-presence, is only possible through the self-touching you relation, which features the presence of a you. The presence of the other as you in the self-touching you relation is an exteriority that makes my own self-reflection possible. I cannot adequately reflect on myself without a you and a self-touching you relation. The self-touching you relation is in the form of the device of other as mirror for the purpose of subjectivation. Other examples of the mirror other in subjectivation are Sartre's keyhole experience, Simondon's moment of trans-individual disindividuation, Kierkegaard's dread, and Heidegger's wake-up call from the conscience. Further, the self-touching you remains incalculable. It is elemental, the irreducible moment of subjectivation. As with incommensurable thinking in excessive thinking, the incalculability of the self-touching you relation indicates that there is something exorbitant beyond the subject that exceeds the self-touching you relation. The inaccessible transcendence of a you who does not let yourself be reappropriated in the mastering reflexivity of the self in the self-touching. Yourself as you is in excess of yourself. Derrida then uses the space, the exteriority opened up by the elemental incalculability of the self-touching you relation as a tool for interrogating the possibility and reality of the introduction of the prosthesis. Ultimately, the purpose of the self-touching you relation is to accommodate the possibility of the event of the prosthesis, operation, or modification, and the thinking discourse it calls for. The account of subjectivation related to touch and technology in On Touching complements Derrida's general account of subjectivation. While his apparent focus is deconstructing the traditional logocentric impulse to personal identity, the search for false reassurance and permanence, it is nevertheless possible to obtain an affirmative account of Derrida's subjectivity. First considering definition and grounds, Derrida's definition of the subject, personal identity, consciousness, is a dynamic flux of different unconnected perceptions. Derrida is initially inspired by Hume's declaration that we are nothing more than a collection of different perceptions which succeed each other in a perpetual flux and movement. The mind is a kind of theater where perceptions successively make their appearance, intermingle, and glide away. Subjectivity is difference, a succession of perceptions, impressions, and ideas that are different, unconnected, and do not comprise a unity. Each perception is a distinct existence, different and distinguishable from every other. Further, there is nothing belonging to these perceptions and uniting them together. The claim to personal identity is merely a quality which we attribute to them because of the union of their ideas in the imagination when we reflect on them. Subjectivity is not a unitary phenomenon. Identity is not a unit. Rather, it is a quality which we attribute to a collection of perceptions. There are no grounds for subjectivity as being unitary. This is in contravention to the traditional view of the subject, where there is persistence and unity of consciousness over time. Instead, for Derrida, the antiquated Cartesian subject must be erased into the discontinuous flow of experience because there is no primordial nature of pure self-presence and identity. Not only are there no grounds for persistence and unity, but also temporality would prevent any identity of presence due to the impossibility of a literal self-presence. The living being cannot be captured in the act because it can only be made self-present once it is past. Now understanding subjectivation as the flux of different perceptions, regarding genesis, the subject does not constitute itself. Subjectivation is an effect of difference, the play of forces that produce all identities. Nothing precedes difference. Subjectivity is an effect of difference, an effect inscribed in a system of difference. The subject is not present or above all present to itself before difference. The subject is not primary and privileged, rather what precedes it is the world system of difference and constitution. Subjectivity belongs a priori to the order of the constituted. Presence, especially consciousness, is no longer the central form of being, but instead a determination and effect of being. Difference is a concept Derrida creates as a tool in his process of deconstruction, which he also calls grammatology, dissemination, and supplement. Reminiscent of Heidegger, the main target of deconstruction is the logocentric metaphysics that for Derrida has plagued all of Western philosophy. Both deconstruction and difference, as one of its methods, simultaneously acknowledge, challenge, and exceed the logocentric metaphysical system. Logocentrism is a desire for presence, a presence of truth, being, meaning, and knowledge, a full and certain knowledge of reality and oneself as a conscious subject. Logocentrism has incorrectly privileged the traditional view of the subject, conscious, self-present, and the present. The structure of logocentric presence is binary pairs, where one side has been favored, privileged, or hierarchized over the other, such as the first term in presence-absence, being-nothingness, mind-body, speech-writing, and identity-difference. Deconstruction seeks to remedy this, for example in identity difference. Now understanding the subject as dynamic flux means there is no identity, only difference. In the concept of difference, Derrida employs both senses of the French verb différer, to differ, and to defer. In the case of the meaning to differ, there are two aspects of différance. First, différance is the difference between a binary pairing's identity and opposite. Second, différance is a movement, process, or concept that precedes the binary pair. Différance precedes. It is a preceding that is the play of forces that produce all identities. Différance is spelled with an A to subvert the traditional privileging in the binary pair, notably of speech over writing, because the A cannot be heard, only written or read. Différance accords primacy to absence over presence. Thus, the metaphysical hierarchy is exposed as arbitrary and capable of change. Différance is also used in the other meaning of différer, to defer. In this case, it is in the sense of postponing identity and meaning. All texts are open to interpretation. No term has identity in and of itself because its identity is established in relation to all other terms, which in themselves have no identity. The differences between terms constitute their identities. Relating difference to subjectivation now, difference is the non-primacy of the subject, the preceding forces that interact to constitutively produce identity relative to other terms. The movement of difference produces a subject. The subject is a dynamic flux of perceptions, an effect of difference, and also a text. Difference, as writing, constitutes the subject. The subject is produced in the world system, written as a system of relations between strata, the psyche, society, and the world. The subject is as any other sign, text, or writing. Personal identity has the same structure as a sign. Like any text, the subject has no intentional identity or unity of meaning and is open to multiple ongoing readings and interpretations. Personal identity has the same structure as the sign because it stands in for something missing, the absence of its own presence and identity. The subject arises in lack, since it is nothing in itself and requires supplementation to make up for a deficiency, to compensate for a primordial non-self presence. To counter its non-self presence, the subject opens to exteriority, to others, as in Heidegger's Mit sign and Simondon's collective individuation, to produce its identity relative to other terms. Reading the general theory and the on-touching accounts of subjectivation together produces a better understanding of human technology and their interrelation. In the general theory, the subject arises as an effect of a world system of constitution and difference in the play of forces that produces all identities. The subject is a discontinuous, non-persistent, non-self-present flux of unconnected perceptions, the text with no unity of meaning, whose identity is constituted in relation to other terms and forever open to interpretation. In the book On Touching, the central subjectivation theme is the configuration of a new interiority-exteriority relation, analogous to Simondon's trans-individual relation, that leads to subjectivation via the prosthetic, ecotechnique as prosthetic. The subject is now even more non-persistent and non-self-present, i.e. non-classical, because the ecotechnique of the prosthetic has created the interior-exteriority possibility space of subjectivation between the subject and technology, both externally as the blind man's stick and internally as the heart implant. In this possibility space, subjectivity remains a dynamic, reinterpretable text because the human-technology relation is always changing, including because technology subjectivates at a much higher rate than humans. Personal contingency as a function of technological contingency constrains but also facilitates and extends the subject's exscription as a flux of different unconnected perception in relation to prosthetic events. The interior-exteriority possibility space deconstructs binaries because the higher order focus becomes function, not definition. The relevant question is not whether something is inorganic or organic, the binary, but rather what it can do, its function. Can the blind man see with the stick? The human-data relation is one form of the human-technology relation. To improve the human-data relation, data needs to become fully fledged as the prosthesis. This requires thinking ecotechnique as big data, thinking a productive prosthetic linkage between human and data. This could be effectuated if big data, i.e. the operators of big data, were to adopt the Derridian view of the subject as non-self-present and non-persistent, and amplify human function by focusing beyond the binary of purchase transactions, buy, don't buy binaries, to interactions that more meaningfully fulfill emotional needs, thereby producing difference-triggered subjectivations. In this way, big data becomes the stick of the blind man, a generative prosthetic linkage between man and technology in the ecotechnical interior-exterior possibility space. Ultimately, Derrida anticipates this possibility space, a virtuality that is the most profound human-technology relation, the final integration of human, the singularity, the event, and technology, the machine, that opens up impossible possibility, the virtualization of the event by the machine to a virtuality that exceeds the classical opposition of the possible and the impossible. Thank you.